All right, here we go. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of it here. Remember, if n is big, bigger than 30, you're going to use a z-score. If n is small, less than 30, you're going to use a t-score, right? Unless the original distribution were normally distributed, then you would go ahead and you would use a z-score. So let's just assume that, well, if you look here, all these n's are less than 30, and it doesn't say anything about the original distribution. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to find critical t-values, right? Critical t-values. So we want to find a 90% confidence interval. So I'm just going to draw my curve here. I want the middle 90%, and I want to figure out what my t-score is for the top of the fence post and the bottom of the fence post. The t at the mean is going to be 0, right? So we got to figure out what the t at the high end and what the t on the low end goes. So the way I would do this is I would say, oh, the middle 90%, that means I have 5% in this tail and 5% in this tail. So I would either, if I were doing normal stuff, I would do invert norm 0.05. That would give me this, right? But this curve is going to be a little different. It's going to be a little fatter in the tails because n is only 10. So if you look at your calculator here, you go second distribution, you're actually going to use number 4 where it says invert t. So you go invert t, and then you're going to find the area. So the area for us is going to be 0.05 or 0.95. And then degrees of freedom. So n is 10, which means it has 9 degrees of freedom. Just n minus 1 is the degrees of freedom. Really simple for a t-curve. Then you hit enter, and it'll give you negative 1.83. So I know my t star is going to be negative 1.83 here and positive 1.83 here. Right? Cool. So let's go ahead and do these real quickly. I'll go ahead and just draw some random curves here, some t curves, not necessarily z curves. So the middle 95% now, 0.95, which means I have 2.5% in each tail. Right, so this is going to be at 0. I want to figure out what these t's are going to be, these critical t's. So I go second distribution, I go invert t, I go 0.025. Degrees of freedom, so n is 12, I got 11 degrees of freedom. So that means negative 2.2 is going to be my t star, negative 2.2, and positive 2.2. Right? This one is exactly the same. I don't know if I wrote that down wrong or what, but I'll just do it real quick for you. It's going to be exactly the same, negative 0.02, negative 2.2, and positive 2.2. I probably wrote that one down wrong. That's okay. 98% with 20 degrees of freedom, right? So this is going to look more like a z curve because n is getting bigger, closer to 30, right? But not quite 30, so I know I have to use my t curve. So again, this is going to be 0. 98%, so I have 2%, so 0.01 over here, and 0.01 over there. So I go second invert t. Let me clear this out. Second distribution, invert t. And then I go 0.01. Degrees of freedom, 20 was my sample size, so I got 19 degrees of freedom. Enter, negative 2.54. So this will be negative 2.54. This will be positive 2.54. So think about what we did with the normal curves, right? We worked from finding those t-stars to finding the distance between here and there in my curve, right? And the way we do that, that's called the margin of error. So that's what we're going to do in the next one. So here they give you a standard deviation, they give you n, and they give you a c, or a confidence level. Right? So what we need to do to find the margin of error, that's going to equal t star, or t critical, times the standard deviation. And for us, the standard deviation is going to be 5 divided by the square root of 16, right? Because just like we did before, so that's going to be my standard deviation. Now all I have to do is figure out what this t star, tc is going to be, right? So again, 0 goes in the middle. I want to find 95, so I got 0.025, 0.025. So I go invert t, just like I did before, second distribution, invert t, and I go 0.025. Then I got 16 degrees or 15 degrees of freedom because n is 16. So I got t to be negative 2.13. And and positive 2.13. Now, if I want to find the margin of error, I just take that 2.13 and I multiply by the standard deviation. So if I take that and multiply by 5 divided by the square root of 16, that will give me my margin of error. It should work out. 2.66. So that means that my margin of error is going to be 2.66 units to the right of the mean and 2.66 units to the left of the mean. Cool. We got a couple more here. So 99% confidence interval. So again, the standard deviation here is going to be 3 divided by the square root of 6, just like before. And then I just take that and I multiply by whatever that T star is, or TC. Right, so let's go ahead and find that. So if we want 99% in the middle, that means I have 1% to play with. So that's going to be 0.005 over here and 0.005 over here. So I'm going to go second distribution, invert T, 0.005, very small. Degrees of freedom, N is 6, so 5 degrees of freedom, again, very small. Enter. You're going to get a T of 4.03. So if I take that and I multiply by 3 times the square root of 6, divided by the square root of 6, excuse me, that will give me my, let's put these in parentheses just in case, that'll give me my margin of error. So my margin of error here is going to be 4.93. So that's the distance between the mean and my fence post. I can go 4.93 units. Confidence level is 90%. Make sure I can see you. 90% here. So that means I have 10% to play with. So I have 5% here and 5% here. The standard deviation is going to be 2.4 divided by the square root of 12, just like before. I got to take that and multiply by my T star. So let's go invert norm. Invert T. My area is going to be 0.05 now. No, it's not. 95. Yeah, 0.05. It is 0.05. Let's see here. My degrees of freedom, 12 was my sample size, so it's going to have 11 degrees of freedom. My T star is going to be 1.8. 1.8-ish times, and then let's do our standard deviation, 2.4 divided by the square root of 12. Negative 1 point, so we'll call the margin of error 1.24. Last one, 98% confidence interval. So I got 98% in the middle, which means I have 1% over here and 1% over there, right? So I just have to find that T star and multiply that T star by the standard deviation divided by the square root of 9. So let's figure out what that T star is. So we go 0.05. Invert T, 0.01. We got 8 degrees of freedom this time. My T star is going to be 2.89 multiplied by 4.7 divided by the square root of 9. Let's see what that's going to give me. 4.53. So margin of error here is 4.53. Okay, cool. So now when we throw it all together, we got 2 examples for you. We're going to do a 90% confidence interval. Here I give you a mean. So we're actually going to create this confidence interval here. So I know to use a t-score because I have n is less than 30. So I know this is going to have to be a t, right? So I got 12.5 in the middle. I know my standard deviation is going to be 2 divided by the square root of 6. Right, and what I need to do is I need to add the margin of error to it, and I need to subtract the margin of error from it, and that will give me the high and low, right? And I'll be 90% confident that the true mean is between these 2 numbers. So this is throwing it all together. So the first thing I have to do is I have to find a T star. So let's go ahead and let's find a T star. Actually, there's a couple different ways to do it. If you're savvy, you'll go into here and you can look at your tests, right? And you can do a T interval, right? You can do a T interval and you can do stat. You'll be able to figure it out from there. We'll do it both ways. So here we go. I'll do this one the long way, and I'll do this one the short way with the calculator. Oh, it looks like they're exactly the same. Nice. Perfect. I'll do one the long way and one the short way. So let's find out what this T star is. So I got 0.90%, so I got 10% in the tail, so I got 0.05 over here and 0.05 over here. So that invert T, let's go invert T here. That's going to be 0.05 degrees of freedom. So we got n of 6, which means I have 5 degrees of freedom. Go ahead and paste that in. We're going to get a T of 2.01. And this is going to be negative, and this is going to be positive 2.015. So now I need to take that 2.015, and I need to multiply by 2 over the square root of 6. So if I take that and multiply, so I'll do second answer, times 2 divided by the square root of 6. Enter. So that's the margin of error that I just calculated, 1.645. So now what I need to do is I need to take 12.5 and I need to add to it 1.645 to get my high fence post, and I need to subtract from it negative 1.645 to get my low fence post. So let's do that real quick. So let's do 12.5, and we'll do plus 1.645. So 12.5, 14.145. And then I'll do the same thing, 12.5 minus 1.645. Now it can be 10.855. So I'm 90% confident that the true mean is somewhere between 10.8 and 14.14. Cool. Now, let's say that you didn't want to go through all that stuff. That's a good example because we had to find the critical z, which was like problems number 1 through 4. And then what we had to do is we had to find the margin of error, which is like the next 4 problems. And then what we had to do is we had to take the margin of error, add it to the mean, and subtract from the mean, and that gives me my confidence interval. Right? But let's say that you got your calculator and you realize when you hit stat and you go over to test that you can go to a t interval, right? And we know our mean is 12.5. We know our standard deviation is 2. And we know our n, not degrees of freedom, we know our n is 6. And we want a 90% confidence interval. Let's make sure we got it right. Boom. 10.8, 14.14. Right? So you go second distribution, you go stat, test. Normally do a z interval, but here n was not big enough, so we have to go t interval, right? Mean, standard deviation, n, boom. We don't have to worry about any degrees of freedom. It'll calculate our interval for us, all right? So that's all good. All right, there you go. Go Bulls.